Last year, a few friends started making voluntary ground rent contributions. What that means and why they're doing it takes a bit of understanding. Julian Pratt, author of the book Stewardship Economy, was one of the initiators, and in January of that year, whilst he was still with us, I had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing him. I'm Gareth Whelan, and today I'm talking to Julian Pratt. Thank you for joining us, Julian. I'll start asking you to say something about yourself.
Well, I'm Julian Pratt, and I worked for most of my life in the healthcare system, wearing one hat or another, and now I'm retired and living in South Devon.
So, this project then we're talking about, how did it come about in the first place?
Well, I suppose we could trace it back any distance, really, but the moment that's really vivid in my mind is one evening when a group of us who meet every month to talk about land and land issues and life in general were meeting in the pub, and John T. Williams came in and he sat down and he said, there are things that we've been campaigning for and writing about and trying to change for years, decades, and it feels as if things are moving, but I'm getting impatient. And he said, I've decided that what I'm going to do is start paying a voluntary contribution based on the value of my land to the local community. And we all thought, wow. And then I thought, yeah, maybe it is time to turn talk into action.
Excellent. In its current iteration, the name of the project at the moment is Making a Voluntary Ground Rent Contribution. What jumps out to me there is ground rent. Can you tell us what that's about?
I mean, the trouble with words is that they're very slippery, and they mean different things to different people. So we use the term ground rent to emphasise the fact that what we're interested in is a distinction between land and the natural world on the one hand, and artefacts and the things that we make on the other. So a car is an artefact, the sort of things, the thing we make, or a chair, and land or natural resources are part of the natural world. And ground rent is the amount, is a payment that somebody's prepared to make in order to access the natural world. So if you think about my house, it's made up of, or our house, it's made up of land, the natural resources, the site which is here, and it's made up of the buildings that are built on it. And the ground rent refers to the amount that I'm prepared to pay for the bit of the natural world that I'm occupying.
So these big ideas, how did you come into the ideas around the significance of land in relation to poverty, living conditions, etc.? It's a massive topic. Where does your passion arise from?
Well, I think I was immensely fortunate in that early on in my career I went to work in a rather remote part of rural South Africa, and I was plunged really into a world in which people were dying of poverty, of absolute poverty, of undernutrition, lack of essential nutrients, infectious diseases, trauma, the sorts of things that used to be the way that everybody in the world used to die from. And I became very aware of poverty as a cause of ill health. And so that was one thing, is that opened my eyes to it. And I suppose that most of my contemporaries back in Britain were sort of struggling with ideas about the ownership of the means of production. But what was apparent to me was the importance of who controlled the land. And one of the reasons for that was that I was working in apartheid South Africa, and a very small proportion of the land of the country had been allocated to black people and a very large proportion to white people. And this was clearly an act of power. And this wasn't just a sort of an involuntary maldistribution, because if you looked at the maps, you could, just close to where I was working, there was the only part of that coast which would function as a viable port, and therefore part of a viable economy. In the middle of an area reserved for black people, this particular port had a little line drawn round it on the map, which reserved it for white people. So you could see that the choice bits of the natural world had been reserved for one particular part of the population. And that all seemed pretty extreme while I was in South Africa. But when I came back to the UK, I realised that when you look at the distribution of ownership of land in terms of acres anyway, that many of the same families have controlled land in the UK since the days of William the Conqueror, and that land ownership, even in this country, even after generations and generations of voluntary transactions, when you trace it back through history, ultimately you come to the use of force and power to allocate land. And I could see that was A, unjust, and B, probably at the root of quite a lot of economic injustice.
And you were saying about your, as someone in the medical profession, that you were seeing the impact clearly in ill health in Africa, but you've also said that you were seeing parallels, if not the same, even in Sheffield.
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, the nature of illness in our society is very different. We don't see people starving to death by and large. We don't see huge numbers of people dying from infectious diseases. We see diseases of, heart disease and diabetes and overweight and cancer and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is that if you look at a map of Sheffield and you look at how old people are when they die, then people in the west of Sheffield live 10 or 15 years longer than people who live in the east of Sheffield.
It's an astounding difference.
It is absolutely astounding, and it's mimicked all over the country. But it means that you can look at the geography and see how poverty of some sort is actually dramatically affecting people's life, length of life, and of course quality of life as well. So the diseases are different, and I think that what's different in our society is that these are diseases of relative poverty, diseases of inequalities in wealth, and so in our country. The main challenge is, in terms of improving the health of the population, seems to me to be how can you reduce inequalities in wealth, and that's where land's a really interesting issue.
We've gone into the why to quite some depth, but this practice that you and the others involved in this project are choosing to take up, how do you go about it?
Well, what we're interested in is, what I'm ultimately interested in is a world in which the natural thing to do is for everybody to pay a ground rent for whatever land and natural resources they use. And so what we're trying to do is to mimic that in a rather localised and moderate sort of fashion, because given the nature of the economy and the other taxes that we have to pay and so on, it's really not possible for most people to pay to make a voluntary contribution that's equal to the whole of the ground rent of their land at the moment. But we'd like to get as close to that as we can, or at least to start moving towards that. So the way that we go about that is that we think how much would our whole property be rented for. How much of that's attributable to land, And then we look at that and think, well, that's quite a lot. I think I'd like to pay maybe 5 or 10% of that, make that as a voluntary contribution, but relate it to the ground rent. So we're thinking about compensating others for the fact that we've got exclusive use of this land. So we calculate that amount and then decide what to use it for.
Okay, so there's the calculation, there's the choosing that it's part of the ground rent, so it's not just money that we have because we have it, and I want to make a charitable contribution. Yeah. It's grounded in the ground, and then there's the question of what's to be done with it.
Well, I think that's very much up for debate, and for each of us to decide what we think is an appropriate use of it. But in the general picture, I think if we want this to be of use to and value to the whole community, to everybody, then there are two sort of extremes in which that could go. One is simply to divide it up into an equal per capita universal basic income for everybody, whatever size of generosity, whether we're talking about parish or larger or global or whatever, but anyway, something that benefits everybody. Or we could say that already we have mechanisms that are intended to benefit everybody in the form of government and government spending, and there would be advantages to using some of this revenue to provide revenue for government. So those are the two big options, and I think most of us feel probably some mix of the two of them is the way to go.
Thank you.